Welcome back to the Game Collection. 8 years ago, I began my journey of finishing and reviewing RPGs, a genre that I didn't think was treated with the time and respect that the games demand from a reviewer. I started off that journey through countless worlds by revisiting and reviewing the game that got me into the genre to begin with, EarthBound. And today, for my 100th review, I wanted to return to where it all began and see if I can give EarthBound the video that it deserves. I am SuperDerek, and this is EarthBound. EarthBound began production immediately after the release of Mother on the Famicom. I talked about Mother just a few weeks ago, and in that video we already covered the history of Ape Inc. and briefly talked about the creator of the series, Shigesato Itoi. Mother was developed pretty quickly, but EarthBound took much longer. So much longer, in fact, that the game was nearly cancelled several times. According to Shigesato Itoi, it wasn't until after Halcon joined the development that things started really coming together, thanks in no small part due to the assistance from the late and great Satoru Iwata. That same Satoru Iwata who famously saved Pokemon and eventually became Nintendo's president and CEO. Halcon and Ape Software would go on to work on several projects together, including a number of Pokemon and Smash Bros. Titles, plus a couple of fishing games by Itoi. But it's safe to say that EarthBound was the beginning of a deep tie between the companies that would last throughout the next decade. Ape Software became Creatures Inc., and Halcon eventually changed their name to HAL Laboratories, and changed their logo to one that was actually designed in part by Shigesato Itoi, a dog incubating some eggs. But that's a story for another day, perhaps. After a long road of development, Mother 2 was finally released in 1994 for the Super Famicom, and the localization process bringing EarthBound to the West began. In today's era, it's easy to take the localization process for granted. The days of very poor localizations are well behind us, for the most part. But in the case of EarthBound, I wanted to take a moment to appreciate the fact that the localization teams, often working as invisibly as possible, are the lens through which Western audiences experience Japanese role-playing games. This is important in all games, with an emphasis on storytelling and dialogue. However, EarthBound, as a humorous and sometimes dark but always heartfelt game, the localization team had a lot of heavy lifting to do, replacing Japanese puns with jokes and gags that would work in English. EarthBound works in no small part due to the writing of the localization team doing their best to channel their own inner Shigesato Itoi. And keep in mind that when I say localization team, I'm actually referring to a grand total of 3 main people. Daniel Osen, who localized Link to the Past, Illusion of Gaia, and eventually Ocarina of Time, among others, began the process in tandem with Japanese writer Masayuki Miura, but eventually Marcus Lindblom would take over and complete localizing the transliterated script. EarthBound was Lindblom's second time finding himself in localization, having only worked on Wario's Woods prior. In hindsight, it's actually kind of a wonder that the localization was as good as it was, despite the flaws, such as translation notes remaining in the final edit of the game. The story of EarthBound begins with our hero, Ness, sleeping away another peaceful night in the year of 1990X. A meteor strikes, rocking the small town of Onett and shaking Ness awake. It is on this fateful night that Ness finds Buzzbuzz, a small insect from the future, pulling a Kyle Reese, saving Ness from a Starman Jr. who came back in time to kill Ness. Unfortunately, Buzzbuzz meets his match, unceremoniously getting squashed by your neighbor's mom. With his final breaths, Buzz tells Ness of the prophecy that it is his destiny, along with 2 other boys and a girl, to save the world from the clutches of a powerful being who is manipulating people and creatures to perform evil. To do this, Ness must collect the melodies from each of the sanctuary locations scattered across the world and record them into his soundstone in order to harness the power of the world. Collecting several melodies to defeat an incomprehensible evil force may sound familiar to you if you watched my recent review of Mother, because it's an idea lifted straight from EarthBound's predecessor. In fact, many ideas throughout EarthBound were recycled from Mother. This includes starting your adventure during a catastrophe in the hero's room, fighting off an alien invasion, malevolent beings affecting the minds of people and wildlife, and collecting melodies to fight the evil force. Some characters are also extremely similar to their Mother counterparts. Ninten with his baseball cap, baseball bat, and psychic powers from Mother are a mirror image of Ness. Lloyd from Mother and his use of ranged weapons, fixing things, explosives, glasses, and finding him first in a school is exactly like Jeff from EarthBound. Anna and her powerful offensive psychic powers is almost exactly like Paula, but that's not to say that EarthBound is lacking in its own unique ideas. Mother 1 may have been a starting point, but there were a lot of changes between the two. Perhaps the biggest difference between the two is EarthBound's emphasis on dialogue. While Mother did have several NPCs with unique and sometimes whimsical dialogue, EarthBound is on another level. There are far more NPCs to talk to, and they are far more verbose, often having multiple pieces of dialogue to offer to persistent players. The NPCs of the world of EarthBound go a long way toward making EarthBound feel especially unique, even to this day in a world full of games that were in turn inspired by EarthBound. The tone of EarthBound on its surface is pretty happy-go-lucky and whimsical, thanks in no small part to the absurdist humor found throughout the game. EarthBound presents a parody view of American life from the 90s as viewed by a Japanese man, so naturally the world is filled with honor-bound hooligans, irresponsible adults who either panic or lend a hand by getting out of the way at best, impromptu photo shoots, and pizza delivery. Fans often meme about the idea of Ness searching a garbage can, finding a whole hamburger and just eating it on the spot, but after a couple of playthroughs, it might start to dawn on you that EarthBound has a pretty dark plot delivered in a very humorous way. Pretty early on in the game, Ness goes to a police station and is attacked by 5 grown adult police officers. A young girl, Paula, is kidnapped by a cult leader based on a real Japanese cult at the time, and they plan to sacrifice her. The intensive martial arts training endured by Pooh includes surrendering his arms, legs, and senses to a disembodied spirit. And eventually, toward the end of the game, there's a jarring moment when the team have to make a very disquieting decision. So don't let the surface-level aesthetic charm you into letting your guard down. EarthBound is as much subtle commentary as it is surface-level slapstick, though you might not see it unless you are looking for it. EarthBound's battle system changes up the Dragon Quest-style gameplay this time around by introducing a subtle but powerful game mechanic, the scrolling hit point meter. During combat, characters' hit points are displayed on a set of spinning slot machine-style reels, and as damage is incurred, those hit points quickly spin down to the new hit point total. These spin pretty quickly, especially early on in the game, but as the game progresses, this mechanic gradually comes into play as your hit point pool increases. If Ness and company are mortally wounded, and you're able to end the battle before those hit points count down to 0, your meter will stop spinning and the character will survive the encounter. Alternatively, if you're able to use a healing item or ability with the hit point meter is still spinning down, the meter will stop counting down and apply all regained hit points to the hit point total at the time that the healing began. This means that if you're hit by a devastating attack, if you're quick enough, you can recover back to maximum hit points using only a minor healing ability. This mechanic is pretty easy to overlook, but if used to your advantage can be a real lifesaver. Another awesome mechanic has to do with enemy encounters. Enemies are displayed on the world map and will walk toward you when you're within range. Engaging these enemies head-on will display a blue swirl and combat will initiate as normal. If you attempt to run and get caught, a red swirl will indicate that the enemy will begin combat with a surprise round. However, if you can engage an enemy from behind, a green swirl will indicate that you get the drop on the enemy and can attack with a surprise round of your own. Furthermore, after defeating the boss of an area, Enemies within the dungeon will flee away from you, making it easy to get the drop on enemies trying to run away. And once you're a good bit stronger than the enemies, EarthBound will actually just grant you an automatic win, along with any experience points and items you would have gained from combat. This system of engagement is by far my favorite mechanic of EarthBound, and it is one that I wish was borrowed from more often by more modern RPGs. And the enemies that you fight within EarthBound are charming as heck too. In EarthBound, you're not just fighting slimes or monsters, but the local flora and fauna too. Where else do you fight ramblin' mushrooms, exploding trees, little UFOs, tentacle monsters, aliens, robots, businessmen, and hippies? The boss of one of the areas is a gigantic, sentient pile of vomit who attacks you with his belches. The designers definitely wanted to have a lot of fun making these enemies, and I certainly had just as much fun fighting them. It's not all rainbows and sunshine though. EarthBound's inventory management system is easily the worst part of the entire game. Items in your inventory do not stack, and each character has a limited number of item slots, 4 of which are pretty much permanently occupied by your current equipment. And in addition to that, Ness in particular has other items that cannot be removed from his inventory, such as the Soundstone and ATM card. So, especially early on in the game, before Ness has any companions, inventory space is at an extreme premium. Shopping in EarthBound is also especially kludgy because when buying or selling an item, you must first select buy or sell from the menu, then navigate to the item in question and then confirm, and then choose who gets it, after which point you have to select buy or sell again and repeat the whole process. So if you want to buy 10 bottle rockets for Jeff, you have to repeat this cycle 10 times rather than simply telling the game you want to buy 10 bottle rockets. Now, some might call this nitpicking, and honestly, it's because it's the only real flaw that I've been able to pick out within EarthBound. I feel obligated to at least mention it to offer some token semblance of impartiality, but let's be real here, despite my best efforts, this review will likely be biased as heck because I just love this game so much. Speaking of which, there is one surprising quality of life improvement during the equipment shopping that I wish was also incorporated into more RPGs. In addition to being able to easily spot equipment upgrades, after buying a piece of equipment, the shopkeepers will just ask you if you want to equip it immediately and allow you to sell off your old equipment. So while in-game shopping is a step backwards, it's also a step forward in other ways. Exploration within EarthBound is overall pretty similar to Mother, in that there is, again, no overworld map where you go to a super zoomed out view of the world and explore it with a bird's eye view. Well, at least for the most part. There is a prehistoric underground cave where you actually do exactly this, but for the most part, the scale at which you explore the towns and dungeons is the same scale at which you traverse between them. It's not quite what I would call a 16-bit open-world RPG, but EarthBound is at least attempting to accomplish something in that same spirit, which is admirable. Walking across EarthBound feels like walking through a caricature of American life in the 90s, which is both extremely charming and somewhat nostalgic to me. Want to hit up an arcade? Go for it! There are pizza shops and burger joints and toy stores and shopping centers that you can walk around in, and just this odd, upbeat optimism about everything. It really brings me back to my childhood days as a latchkey kid, going off on my own, building secret hideouts in the woods, riding my bicycle around town, and generally living a carefree lifestyle. It's a lifestyle I don't think most people under 20 could fathom today. Aside from small American town vibes though, you will find a bunch of other towns such as Winters, a gray island featuring Stonehenge, and aquatic cryptid named Tessie that inhabits the local loch, clearly inspired by the UK. There's also the island of Summers, the vacation resort, Scaraba, a pyramid-studded desert with its own sphinx based on ancient Egypt, and oh yeah, a giant underground world of dinosaurs, because why not? There's a good wide variety of environments to explore here. At the time of EarthBound's original release, the visuals of EarthBound really weren't too much to write home about. They weren't pushing boundaries the same way Chrono Trigger and Terranigma did. The game eschewed the detailed, stylized, and anime-inspired work of its contemporaries in favor of a simpler character design, outlined in black like a cartoon or comic strip characters. Players experiencing the game today for the first time are probably less likely to be off-put by the designs because they have aged pretty well. By aiming on a stylized approach instead of attempting highly detailed artwork, I find the games just don't date themselves as much, but that may also just be an aesthetic preference. In the music department, EarthBound is an absolute treat. Unfortunately, due to Sony's current iron grip on the soundtrack, I can't feature any of it during this review without having my video hidden from all the United States. So instead, you've been enjoying a few covers by Eric Ladd from Retro Game Remix, who's a stellar musician, as well as a fellow fan of EarthBound, and a friend of the show. So do us both a favor and check out his channel when you get a chance. I'll have links in the description, and he's actually going to be releasing this entire EarthBound album, and it's just so good. Definitely check it out. EarthBound's music has borrowed heavy inspiration from the likes of the Beatles, Chuck Berry, and the Beach Boys. So the irony that Sony is guarding the copyright of this soundtrack so fervently is so thick you could cut it with the Sword of Kings. Speaking of which, dare I dream? Yes! And if that ticks you off half as much as it ticks me off, please consider becoming a supporter of the game collection by joining the channel memberships or Patreon, because you'll get access to the uncensored version of this review, in addition to the usual benefits of getting early access and ultra high quality downloads. Stick it to the man and help support this show using the links below. Normally I don't promote this sort of thing during reviews, but Sony is sort of forcing my hand by preventing me from properly critiquing this aspect of the game. EarthBound ended up only selling about 140,000 copies in the United States. It shipped in an enormous cardboard box and came with a full-length strategy guide fashioned after a travel guide and included scratch and sniff stickers and a bunch of other cool goodies. For my most recent playthrough, I followed along using this guide for the first time and really enjoyed the supplemented experience. Unfortunately, the rarity of the guide makes this a prohibitively expensive endeavor, but there are online PDFs available for anyone who would like to get a similar experience. The cartridge that I played was my own from childhood, but the box and guide were donated by Kuro Itakai, to whom I will be forever grateful. EarthBound has the distinction of having one of the longest running and most engaging cult followings of any RPG out there, and its legacy includes being the inspiration for countless game developers to take up the craft. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy of which includes Undertale by Toby Fox, who cut his teeth by making the EarthBound Halloween hack fan mod years prior. This fandom would go on to play a huge role in the future of EarthBound and the Mother series, but that's a story for another time. EarthBound has been a pricey game to pick up a physical copy of for a long time, due in no small part to the limited numbers that sold, and also due in part to the high demand from its growing number of fans. In Japan, EarthBound got a second retail release in a combo cartridge as Mother 1+2. That release did eventually get a fan translation, but the audio is really bad. I wish I could have you hear some for comparisons, but again, Sony is doing everything in their power to keep that from happening. Bottom line is, though, I would probably avoid the Game Boy Advance release despite the new localization, or at least maybe play it on mute. There are other official ways to play EarthBound today, though. In July of 2013, EarthBound received a re-release on the Wii U Virtual Console, complete with a digital copy of the elusive game manual. Owners of the new Nintendo 3DS would also be graced in 2016 with a release of EarthBound on its exclusive Virtual Console. And in 2017, the American Super Nintendo Classic Edition launched, featuring a set of curated Super Nintendo titles, one of which was EarthBound. EarthBound was the RPG that I fell in love with during my adolescence that turned me on to the genre. It was also the first game that I ever reviewed in the game collection, and now it is the game I chose to review for my 100th episode of the game collection. I mentioned in my review of Suikoden 2 that it's unlikely for any game to be truly life-changing, but in retrospect, who knows what I'd be doing in an alternate universe where EarthBound wasn't my gateway into RPGs? Would I have even started reviewing games at all? Who can say? Despite that, I've tried my hardest to speak objectively about my very subjective experience with the game. Few games help me remember the feeling of childlike wonder as much as EarthBound. This goofy, upbeat, but heartfelt game. And that's why I find myself looking for excuses to return to it time and time again. It centers me, and it reminds me of the reasons that I love role-playing games, and it's the reason that the game collection even exists at all. And so of course EarthBound has found itself a spot, front and center, in the game collection. The Game Collection is a viewer-supported show. If you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing. For live streams of my playthroughs, follow me on Twitch. And thank you for watching.